Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. So I did a couple album reviews of Neil Diamond records recently, and Neil Diamond has been one of my biggest musical heroes throughout my adult life. But I decided it might be interesting to see if I could learn a little more, read an actual biography of him. So I went to see what the public library had and kind of hoped that by reading this, it might inform my album reviews, take them to the next level. So this is called Neil Diamond, His Life, Music, His Passion. It's by an author named Laura Jackson, who's someone who seems to write a lot of biographies, including one of Brian Jones, I think. So someone quite immersed in the world of music. And it's actually quite short for a biography, just over 200 pages long. And in some ways, I'm kind of grateful for this. One thing that frustrates me is I'm someone who loves to go to the library, loves to go to bookstores, constantly inspired. But honestly, I have no idea how people find the time to be big readers because so many books are just, so long, they require such a huge level of commitment. So when someone finds a way to be concise and you feel like you can read a good text at a slightly swifter pace, I think that's great. I hope that doesn't come across as anti-intellectual on my part. I just want to read more books. It would be nice to read more medium-length books instead of just, a few super long ones. Now, at the same time, when you have a book of this length, it's going to come with its downsides. So at the beginning, I really liked the pacing of this book. The way it sort of described Neil Diamond's childhood, a little bit of backstory about the borough of Brooklyn, New York, where he was born. The weird fact that despite being someone who is seen as writing very sensitive, tender music, someone who's always struggled with shyness, there was a brief point around the age of 12 when he got involved with street gangs and luckily pulled himself out of it before he got into real trouble. And he was an interesting character as a student. He was someone who was shy, who didn't focus well enough to do well in school, but for whatever reason, he picked up on the hobby of writing poetry. And insofar as he was able to get into romantic relationships, it was because he was known as the poetry guy. So, this way of summarizing his childhood, having this bird eye view, showing what an interesting combination of features early Neil Diamond had, I think this biography did a really good job of that. There's a chance if it went at the more snail's pace of, longer biographies, you might lose sight of that interesting combination of character traits. There's certainly an art in bringing things together. I guess where I was a bit disappointed is once it actually gets into his career, it feels like things move very fast. It was hard to almost notice the moment. When did this guy go from guy who was writing lots of songs for lots of different people to one of the biggest stars in the world? It was almost confusing because, when he has his first big singer-songwriter album, Velvet Gloves and Spit, it didn't seem like it was reviewed that well. Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show did a bit better, but it just feels like there's this sudden jump. And unfortunately, this book, once it gets into his career, it's trying to very quickly go through everything. So one thing I was frustrated about before I did a review of the album Taproot Manuscript, I wanted to learn more about that one because that may be Neil Diamond's most experimental record. Given that he's not a classically trained musician, it's interesting that the second half of that record is largely instrumental music and it's African inspired music. And I was really hoping to know more about the research process behind it, what Neil looked like as a composer, what specific parts of Africa influenced the music. And unfortunately, this book just gives it, the blurb treatment. So I don't know any more about Taproot Manuscript than I did before. Now, I guess the one thing about the quick way that this goes through all the records is that there are a few records I hadn't really thought about before that now I'm very curious about. So this book really sold me on the importance of Neil Diamond's 1996 country album, which features a bunch of duets and lots of co-composing with big names from the country industry, Tennessee Moon. It described one of the songs as being his most emotionally vulnerable since I Am, I Said. And none of the songs on Tennessee Moon really became part of Neil Diamond's greatest hits. So I'm really curious about that one and hope to get my hands on a copy. I mean, part of the reason it's so weighty is that that album came out a few years after he divorced his wife, Marcia. And Neil Diamond and Marcia for years were held up as the good couple of Hollywood. Neil Diamond was not a bad boy, other than very occasional pot. He didn't do drugs at all. He was, if anything, scorned by his fellow rock stars for being the guy who said, don't do drugs, just have a family life. And the tragedy, if there's any in this book, is that even the most clean cut of rock stars found that the demand of touring made it very hard for him to have a normal family life. And so he could love his wife and love his children, and his marriages could still collapse. So in short, I feel like I got a few more details in this book than I would just from being a Neil Diamond fan, picking up ideas on the internet and the ether, etc. I got to appreciate things like his friendship with Robbie Robertson, how much he looked up to Sir Laurence Olivier when he was acting in The Jazz Singer, his constant yearning to be in film, and the fact that he almost played Lenny Bruce in a film at one point. Certainly some interesting details, but there are also points in here where this book just feels like it's a series of blurbs. So I'd be curious if anyone else has another Neil Diamond biography that you would recommend. Not that I'm, gunning to read two Neil Diamond biographies in a row, but this one has its pros and its cons, and I'd be interested to hear what people think of other Neil Diamond books out there. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.